The reason why I want to do something a little different this week, and Mercedes, I think you would agree with me. I haven't run this past you yet, this thought, but I think you'd agree. You were on vacation mode, so you're in an unusually buoyant and effervescent and friendly and flexible state. She's still in vacation mode.
It's true. It's true. I'm so colorful, too.
I should send you away on vacation a lot more because it's so much better when you get back.
I'm in agreement.
All right,
but let's hear this idea,
Here's the thought. The thought is this. I really believe that the way in which the clickbait news cycle, especially because I do Flashpoint, I do news, I do daily analysis, and people look to me for the what's going to happen type stuff, whether it's with gold or money, economics, politics. So here's the deal. It doesn't matter what happens. I mean, I've often wanted to do a broadcast where it would be, what was happening that was historically significant in the rise and fall of the Roman Empire as a backdrop to the book of Acts? Because it's hardly ever mentioned what's going on in the bigger, because God was doing something in the book of Acts. So here's the question for you. What is God calling you to do with the backdrop of all this other stuff going on? Don't get lost over there. What are you supposed to be doing? Because you might actually be missing a moment because you're not capitalizing on your assignment and what you're supposed to do, because we get sucked into the vortex of all kinds of current events. So we were talking about Jesus was talking about stewardship. And one of the unique words that is used in the Bible that we quote, and I think we don't understand what it really says. Jesus says to his stewards, he gave them money, gave them talents of silver, and he said to them, occupy till I come. And I thought that occupy is be a cultural presence, be a voice for righteousness, be salt and light. That's how we teach it. But what actually does the word occupy mean? And so Mercedes will tell us, what does that word occupy mean?
Occupy. Oh, that's really interesting, Lance. I think it means to, which you told me before, is to buy and sell, is to actually trade, do business, be a part of the culture that you're in. Think
about that, folks. And that's right, Mercedes. You did pay attention when I said that.
I did. I listened to the lesson between the breaks.
The word occupy means, it was a commercial word. It meant engage in profitable transacting. And the reason why that's so important is because your being able to engage in profitable transactions is part of the metrics of how you level up your stewardship. You should take the opportunity you have and create a bigger one. You should take the resource you have and multiply it. You should take the influence you have and expand it. That's what the word occupy actually means. It means transact business till I come back. And that ought to tell you something. That till Jesus comes back, the entrepreneurial spirit is going to be alive in the kingdom of God, because we're called to transact and increase.
I love it.
All right, guys want to take a look at this 7mmastery.com is where I think we're going to have the domain. But you can go to lancewallnau.com/mastery and get the content. And maybe we'll just be able to make this the preamble to the course, so you guys can take a look at it for yourself, or at least look at a sample of it right now. 90% of Christians are kind of like the Old Testament Jews. 10% of the body of Israel were Levites. Now, coincidentally, I happen to be a Levite. My bloodline, my father's side of the family are rabbis and Levites. So I understand a little bit about this almost instinctively. The teaching gifts, apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers, they teach the tribes of Israel. But the tribes of Israel, 90% of them, aren't supposed to be replicating their life in the pulpit or in the synagogue. They participate there, but they go out into their vocation. In their vocation, they expand the borders of Israel. They occupy the area of the Amalekites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Canaanites. It works in the Old Testament because they're going out and they're literally taking territory to be occupied by their people and their faith. When the New Testament comes along, Jesus tells his disciples, go into all the world and preach the gospel. Make disciples of nations, teaching them. If you could see the parallel, it's that we don't go out and subjugate by conquest. we do go out in spiritual warfare and bring every thought captive to obedience to Christ. That's the New Testament version. But we're foggy on this because still the most ardent and devoted believers would like to leave the world, as I did, left corporate America, left business, in order to go serve God, which sounds like the right thing, so that we could be dedicated to God as God's ambassadors, revivalists, soul winners, ministries. And remember, 10% of the body of Christ is called to that full-time capacity. And yet 90%, the way we do it now, are spectators funding the 10% who theoretically will change the world. How's it working? It's not working. As much as I want to be optimistic about the future and say that there are great days ahead, and I have a lot of pressure on me to say that a lot because it's what people want to hear. I want you to be able to be ambassadors of faith and good news, but I want you to know the lay of the land and see what exactly is happening. Jesus gave his disciples some sometimes foreboding premonitions and prophecies of the future. He says, look, there's going to be wars and rumors of wars and famines. And he didn't say it's all going to be okay. He said it's going to be like this, but see that you are not troubled. For these things must take place. I've got a plan. So the real thing that Jesus said is remember, and he literally says this, and remember when these things happen, I told you. Why? Because if something's going wrong and you think that God told you that wasn't going to happen, then you feel you have a crisis of faith. But if you know you're going into a storm and God says there's going to be opposition, there's going to be all kinds of waves, you're going to have a lot of dangers, toils, and snares, you're going to come through it. My grace is with you. Stick with me. There's glory on the other side. I built you for exploits. You can handle this. Now, that's a different kind of a message. And I think that the wake-up call for me probably came from my own daughter and her girlfriend. It was Joy with her girlfriend, Hannah Fentress. And I can remember giving my daughter and her friend, my thinking on what was coming because I could see the Seven Mountain message was more important than I thought, that it really lays out, you could say, Israel, we're like Joshua, and the seven mountains is this, literally in the Deuteronomy, it says, you are going up against seven nations that are greater and mightier than you, but I'm with you. And so I'm looking at those seven mountains. Look at the media mountain or the academic mountain. Oh my God, it's formidable. It's for us to think that it's going to be an easy thing to change is naive. Any more than the little Jewish people going up against giants thought that they could do it in their own ability. But if God's in it, it's a different story. So I remember talking to my daughter and saying, man, I'm telling you, I see that Marxism is gaining a stronghold, that your campus is going to become more radicalized. What's on the campus is going to be in the streets. What's in the streets is going to be in the politics. And what I see coming, and I was giving a very dystopian view of where I saw culture going. Now, mind you, this is like 8 to 10 years ago. I was right. But she looked up at me with that way that only a daughter can do. And she said, but Daddy, what about my destiny? Because what I was forecasting was, we got to move quickly. It's the end times. And I believe that there's an end time harvest and outpouring and a rapture will be, that God will intervene. And there's promises in the Bible about saving you from the hour that tries everyone on the earth. And I believe. But what she was saying is, I grew up in a church which talks about prophetic destiny and exploits and what God calls you to do. And it sounds to me like you're drawing the curtain on this thing pretty quickly, and that the best we could hope for is a glorious exit strategy before, all hell breaks loose. And I got so convicted because I saw that I had to have a responsibility to see the reality, but frame it in a way that accommodates the fact that there's destiny in your life that is going to be fulfilled. So I had to kind of pull out of that dystopian perspective to come back and say, well, Lord, what's the good news for people like my daughter? And that was when the Lord basically started to say, why don't you look at the other side of the equation? And that is in the period of the time of the great shaking of earth, I'm shaking it, not the devil, because I promised something, and I promised the kingdom is going to become manifest. So I started looking at the Bible to see a track that most Christians don't preach on. In Hebrews, the Bible says that 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 God yet has promised once more he will shake the heavens and the earth. And this opened up a whole new theology for me. I preached it at one of Andrew Wommack's conferences recently in Phoenix, and he got up and endorsed it, basically said, I agree with him. I agree. So it's not often preached, but it's logically is the next step is, what shaking are we in? We're in a period of time of vast instability. Things are, you feel it. Revolution is in the air and upheaval. And you're looking at bizarre things that are being cloaked with power. Transgender ideology being literally put into office with candidates. And you're looking at that going, is that where the future is? Well, the shaking is something which I'm going to talk about right now in the Seven Mountains context. It's something God is doing. But it's a shaking to remove hindrances out of the way for the advancing of the kingdom of God. And that's a different take than most people have. I'm not asking God to stop what is inevitably going to happen, because Jesus said to his disciples, these things must take place. But if I can give you a theology as to why they must take place and why it's a promise that the shaking is happening and what God is building in the midst of shaking and how you fulfill your unique assignment in the midst of all that, well, then I've gone into some interesting leadership territory, because I'm describing the future, the way that you're going to end up intercepting it. And I'm giving you a map to navigate through that uncertain future. And if you have a map and you have action and you have a track to run on, well, then you can take action, have traction.
You know, at some point in my life, people started coming up to me and saying, how much for your illustrations? It's kind of like a Picasso. I just got done doing a teaching here, and it's like all this impressionistic artwork. The reality is, God is giving us downloads now. Those of us that are called prophetically to equip the body. There's an open heaven of insight, expediting revelation and information coming to the church world to take territory. Many of you have been wondering, when am I going to see the breakthrough? Well, we're discussing here the force of favor, divine appointments, prophetic vision. I want to take this teaching and put it into your hands. I want you to have the very most powerful, most recent, updated technology to be able to apply the supernatural to the assignment that God gave you. We're calling this the 7M Mastery Series, but you can get access to it at lancewallnau.com/mastery. lancewallnau.com/mastery.
Let's start with an interesting quote. I got a really well-worn book here, and it's a book by James Davison Hunter. I like books, prefer them to digital, because I underline in different colors. So when I do in different colors, I can literally see, if I go a second time or third time, I'm looking at kind of like what are the ideas the Spirit of God is impressing me with? And Hunter caught me with this. He says, to understand how to change the world. Now, this guy's a scholar, so he's a recognized scholar in our Christian camp. He says, to understand how to change the world, one must begin with an understanding of what is to be changed. In short, everything hinges on how we understand the nature of culture. So when we talk about changing the world, Christians use this language all the time. But to a really discerning person, you have to ask yourself, well, what has to be changed in order to change culture? And you can find a range of opinion about culture these days, but one perspective on the matter has gained predominance in the public imagination. And this view is echoed by politicians and their campaign rhetoric and reinforced through popular media. The substance of this view can be summarized something like this. The essence of culture is found in the hearts and minds of individuals. It's what we call values. Values are moral preferences, inclinations toward or conscious attachment to what is good, what is right, what is true. Culture is manifested in the ways these values guide our actual decisions. We individuals are making those decisions all the time about what we do, how we spend our money, how we spend our time, etc., how we raise our children, where we worship, what we worship, whom we worship, and so on. But this view of culture is made up of the accumulation of values held by the majority of people and the choices made on the basis of those values. By this view of culture, everything is made up by this. So here's what he's saying. He's saying that, and this is typically what I taught too, and you could be thinking the same way, that you know what culture is? Culture is the collective sum total of all like a big stew of the collective values of the culture of people, of individuals. If we could just get individuals to turn their life over to different values, we can shift the culture. And this feeds very well into our theology of, if we have evangelism and a great awakening, we'll have a lot of people saved. If a lot of people are saved, then certainly that will change the culture. Now, I was operating from that premise. And this is why I only wrote 2 books. The other guys have written 20, 30 books. But I was wrestling with one subject, and that is like, what is the real paradigm for Christian engagement in culture? And what is the actual context for destiny to be fulfilled in the future? And my assumption was, if we have a great awakening, an outpouring, enough prayer, enough revival, we can see move of God, souls will get saved. If enough souls get saved, the culture will change. And I dare say, if I was to survey you, most of you are probably assuming the same thing. Most of you that are watching are believing the same thing. I thought that way. Hunter, as a scholar, blows it up. He says, this is the prevailing view, and it's almost entirely false. And then as a scholar, he explains why that isn't the case. But I want you guys to catch how this works, because it goes to the 7 mountains a little differently than people think. So the idea that individual hearts and minds get changed and you get enough, like a tipping point. Like I was teaching this, I was saying, tipping point, like let's say you get a 51% change in a culture. Well, if you get 51%, then the scale tips this way. We've got to get to that 51%. Well, and then I start reading where we have countries in the world where you already have a majority Christians. In America, for instance, as Hunter says here, how large do you really think the LGBTQ community is? It's popularized. No doubt a new generation is all identifying with it. But when he wrote this book like 10 years ago, he said it's 3% of the population. He said, how is it 3% has taken over 30% of the population, 30% evangelical, born again, and pro-life Catholics that are charismatic? How did 30% get taken over by 3%? It's not because they have a 51% conversion tipping point. It's because they occupy centers of extraordinary influence, and they're aggressive about their ideology. So Hunter's premise is culture isn't changed by our prayers for revival, our camp meetings, our soul winning, which is, I'll bet you 90% of Christians are giving their offerings and supporting ministries under the assumption that they're going to change the world through some revelation of a revival that's coming, and all the souls are going to get saved. Agree? So here's what Hunter says. He says cumulatively, what all this means is that if a culture is good, it's because of the good values by individuals that lead to good choices. By contrast, if a culture is bad or in decline, it must be because the values or worldviews held by individuals are mistaken or even immoral, and those corrupt values lead to bad choices. Cumulatively, those mistaken ideas, corrupt values, and bad choices create an unhealthy culture. There's the idea that individuals aggregately are shaping culture. And he says, Chuck Colson's book, How Now Shall We Live, has been particularly influential in Christian circles in promoting the perspective, and that is this perspective. One illustration he offers to explain how worldviews work is the case of secular evolutionary theory. In a word, Darwinism. Colson argues that our views of our origins profoundly shape our understanding of ethics, law, education, even sexuality. If humans are the products of evolutionary forces, then morality is nothing more than an idea that appears in our minds when we have evolved to a certain level. If Darwinism is true, there is no divine law or transcendent moral order. That's the reason why the whole evolution thing is significant, because it's the premise for whether or not there's any validity to man made in the image of God, and whether any of that has a credibility. Yet Darwinism, Colson explains, has a variety of empirical and scientific problems with it. Most importantly, secular evolutionary theory cannot explain the irreducibility of the complex structure in nature. The point is that he's going on here is that you could say that, as Hunter has here, he says scientific community isn't all in consensus on evolutionary theory either. It's presented as though it is. He said, in fact, you still have a consensus among them that there's plenty of room for other theories, but you don't hear it. The point is, if a minority of people have a belief in evolution and the majority really don't embrace it, and even in the scientific community they have a lot of debates about exactly what they're talking about, how is it that it's the prevailing ideology? It's because it's been embraced by the institutions at the universities. And the moment the universities embrace an idea, it goes viral into the system because it's reinforced as though it is reality. What Colson basically says here, or what Hunter says, is that there is a way in which evangelism happens, but it happens through the high places that are transmitting the influence over culture. So let me just stop and break that down. For me, the analogy would be like an airplane. If you have an airplane, the cabin crew, when Al-Qaeda takes over, they got to get into the cockpit, lock the door, and crash the plane. The entire plane is being led. Basically, you got 300 people on a plane, but 3 people are going to determine where the plane goes. It's the people that are in the cockpit. Add to that 2 or 3 people that have the microphone outside the cockpit, and you've got control of the airways and the navigation. To me, this is why the idea of 7 mountains is so critical, because we keep on focusing on a bad strategy to convert hearts and minds while we're missing the cockpit and the intercom. So meanwhile, the cockpit's taking people somewhere, and the intercom is propagandizing them into a new direction. Does this make sense to you? So the idea of what we're up against then makes a lot more sense when we think about we lost the culture war because we never properly defined how to fight it. We've been fighting a great awakening, prayer movement, soul winning, revival church mentality. So let's go over here and see, how that looks with the 7 mountains concept. Remember what I said to you earlier for how nations are shaped. We're going to go to the idea of nations in a bit. But if we take the church mountain over here, the theory of the case has been, and I've been kind of like hostage to this for my whole life, is that if we have a revival, which by the way, not knocking it, but remember the 10% of the Levites that make up this particular synagogue over here, this is where the temple and training is, 90% of you are going to be going out into these areas. Even me, I came out of the business mountain full tilt into this, and I got sent back out and dispatched to do what? Media. Why do I have to have a secular media company? Because the only way I can reach the audience and the harvest out here is to grab my own intercom and talk to who I can. So I got like 10 million downloads now. I think that it's possible that we can do other media, but I'm over here now going into the business mountain. I'm working over here in the media mountain because when I was over here, I was just talking to Christians. Now, if you've got your TBN show, that's great. Christians do need edification, exhortation, and comfort. But I can tell you right now, Gabe will tell you, guy in our audience, that the secular audiences are not going to the Christian channels to go get information on life, lifestyle, and difficult choices. The Christians go there. So if 90% of the body is called to go into all the world, the way that we've interpreted this, and tell me if I'm not true on this. We've interpreted this from the paradigm of the revival and soul winning, which is obviously important. I mean, it's critical. But the revival, soul winning, and church planting movement, this is where, I'll bet you most of our money and energy goes in the church world. It's going here. So when we go into all the world, what do we think about doing? We think about planting missionaries into these places. In other words, we think about replicating the same problem we've already got, a separated church from culture. And we go plant a missionary, or we have an evangelist. And then we have flags in our sanctuary of all the places where we support what? We support this focus. And then we wonder why nations are getting worse and culture isn't changing. Well, the paradigm is flawed. The paradigm, so I came from the world system into this, pastored for 20 years, and while I'm there, working on, we need a move of God, we need a revival. And I mean, I've been in the revivals of Toronto, Rodney Howard-Brown. Kim Clement was in my church on a regular basis. We had a tremendous watering hole of revival activity. We had visitations from God. But I never saw Providence, Rhode Island change. I never saw New England change, because my theory of the case was, if we could just break through this spiritual realm and bring heaven down here it would suck the whole world into a great awakening, Jonathan Edwards, move of God. But when I met with John Arnott in Toronto, where they had the Toronto visitation. He was very honest with me. He said, everything we had here, millions of people came through, didn't change Toronto. Go to Pensacola. I'm going to be there with Flashpoint. We're going to be in the sanctuary that was hosting a revival for 5 years. Pensacola didn't change. Toronto didn't change. The Azusa Mission may have changed Christianity around the world, but the Azusa Mission didn't change Los Angeles. Does this make sense to you? And your generation has to ask the question as to whether or not something's flawed in how we approach this. And I would suggest to you that by having our money and our finance and our energy all focusing on somebody reaching the world for Jesus and not realizing that what we're called to do is we're called to go into all the world, that it's not talking about going into different nations and planting a church. It's talking about going into different systems once the church is planted. Wow. We go into all the systems. So now when we look at the Grammys or we look at the Academy Awards or we look at politics and we lament that it's getting worse and worse, it's satanic and weird, well, you have to ask yourself, what's the Christian engagement in those areas? To what degree do we celebrate arts as Christians? To what degree are we making movies that aren't just overt Christian movies about getting converted, but movies about poignant life themes that, life is like 90% of life isn't all about, your prayer life. It's about what are you going to do with your finances and with your kids and with your managing your life's choices. My point is, go into all the world. I go into the Caribbean, for instance, and when I'm in the Caribbean, I'll get off I speak on different ships and cruises, and I'll go check the church out when I get there, and I'll go there and I'll see there's a cornucopia of churches all competing with each other in these little islands. And so you got this church in front of this church. Some of them are in tents, and they're literally across from each other. And I'm looking at that and going, I meet with the mayor, I meet with the governor, I meet with the business leaders. What's the number one problem you got? Corruption. Well, the number one problem you got is corruption. You got drugs, you got sex trafficking, you got dysfunctional business. Well, why is that? Well, because the government's corrupt, so the government's working with the businesses, and the businesses are corrupt. Oh, wait a second. So you're telling me, if I'm getting this picture correctly here, you're telling me that you've got your business and your government over here is working together corruptly with, well, what's the church doing? The church is replicating what America does, trying to build a bigger church, get people saved and involved with the church, do Christian television in the islands, be on TBN, broadcast in the islands, right? Meanwhile, what should they be doing? They should be making disciples that are the 90% that are attending the church, training them how to go into the systems in order to occupy till I come. Not occupy over here with a bug-out bag in the wilderness, but occupy over here. The word occupy, you'll find out in the Greek, is to transact by doing business. Well, that's just a sample from the training. There are 7 modules in the Mastery course, literally showing you how to create a destiny map, utilizing a process that we've created that enables you to take your whole history up until now and see the patterns of where God is taking you. You want to get a hold of that whole 7 module course at lancewallnau.com/mastery. It will change your life.
Did you enjoy this latest episode? Please remember to share it with your friends, because the more knowledge you have, the better equipped you are to navigate the world.